Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you, an extremely rare find. A dungeon-born monster, unlike anything we've seen in recent years. The auctioneer dramatically pulled the velvet cloth off the cage, revealing Gleam. The audience gasped collectively as the small, white ant, about the size of a small dog, sat in the middle of the cage. Her ivory exoskeleton gleamed under the lights, giving off a faint, otherworldly glow. Rusty's heart, or what passed for it in his armor, tightened. Gleam was shackled, her legs bound with strange metallic bands that prevented her from moving too much. She twitched but remained still, seemingly exhausted. Rusty could only imagine the horrors she had been through. This here, ladies and gentlemen, is not just a regular ant but a gleaming mana ant, a very rare find indeed. According to our research, it has demonstrated intelligence far beyond that of its kind and can even use magic on its own, magic attuned to light, something almost no other monster is capable of. The crowd murmured in amazement as Gleam's cage was displayed prominently on stage. Her shimmering white exoskeleton, illuminated under the lights, made her stand out from anything else auctioned that evening. Rusty clenched his fists, the metal of his gauntlets groaning softly as he fought to keep his emotions in check. His friend, the one who had saved him, was now a spectacle for these people. He had learned to distinguish some of these people's expressions, and he didn't like any of them. His rage began to grow, to the point where his armrest started to splinter under his tightening grip. Rusty, calm yourself. If you damage something here, you might be thrown out before you can even make a single bid. Alexander shouted, trying to calm him down. Judging by the number of guards around us, it would be best if you didn't do anything rash, Rusty. Calm your nerves before it's too late. Aberdan agreed with Alexander for once. Although he had joked about killing everyone here when the time came, he didn't believe they would leave in one piece. There were far too many guards, many at least on Rusty's level, and some even stronger. As just an E-rank monster, even with his darkness element, Aberdan knew he wouldn't stand a chance here. We will begin the bidding for this rare gleaming mana ant with 5 gold coins. The auctioneer announced, waving his hands dramatically. Some of the people were intrigued but luckily most of the big spenders were already gone. He had prepared for this, gathered every coin he could, but even at the starting price, his gold could dwindle faster than expected. He knew Gleam was valuable, but seeing her displayed like this, exploited for her rarity, filled him with fury. Before he could even lift his paddle, others already started bidding. 6 gold coins. A voice from one of the nearby seats called out. Rusty recognized the person from somewhere, but he couldn't place them as most humans looked too similar to him. Hey, isn't that one of the people from back then? Alexander asked, and Aberdan quickly confirmed. His name was Eugene, as I recall. And my memory is never wrong. You've got a good memory. Rusty muttered, unsure of what they were talking about as he didn't remember anyone by that name. Was he someone important? Well, he was involved in taking Gleam out of the dungeon that one time. You were a bit preoccupied with your fury, so you probably didn't notice. Rusty tried to recall the incident, but the memories were hazy. His mind had been clouded by rage during Gleam's capture. He'd been focused on getting her back, chasing after a group of humans until he hit the dungeon's boundary. It seemed that Eugene had been one of the 2 non-adventurers there at the time. Now, for some reason, he was bidding on Gleam. 7 gold coins. Rusty finally raised his paddle, marked with the number 45. 8 gold coins. The voice rang out almost immediately after Rusty raised his paddle. His chest tightened as he scanned the room, looking for the source. It wasn't Eugene. A man in a deep blue cloak stood up from one of the private booths reserved for wealthier patrons, his face hidden beneath a shadowed hood. Beside him stood 2 hulking figures, clearly bodyguards, their armor gleaming menacingly under the auction house lights. Rusty hadn't noticed them before, but now they were hard to miss. 10 gold coins. Eugene called out, sounding confident as he matched the mysterious bidder without hesitation. The room buzzed with murmurs as the bidding escalated, and Rusty felt that this wouldn't be that easy. He had hoped to not involve many people in this bid but for some reason, there were more people interested in Gleam than he had thought before. 13 gold coins. The man in blue said in a calm yet somewhat threatening tone. Rusty's hand tightened around his paddle. He had enough to go higher, but his resources were finite. For some reason, these people sounded quite confident but perhaps he was mistaken. F15. Eugene's voice was no longer calm as he raised the bid by another 2 gold coins. It was clear he had exceeded his self-imposed limit and was likely dipping into his reserves. The other person in the booth, though potentially wealthy, didn't have limitless funds, a fact a Burden had taken note of. Those people have bid on several other items and won a few. That last one must have really strained their coffers, they shouldn't have much left. Rusty could only hope his nosy guide was right. For now, he waited, watching as the two bidders continued their battle. 16. One of them called. 16.5. 18. As the bid reached 18 gold coins, the auction hall began to fall silent. I hear 18, will I hear 19 from the nervous gentleman there? If not, I'm afraid this incredible creature will be sold to the discerning bidder in the blue cloak. Rusty felt that this was the moment to go in, he still had a chance. 18 gold was already more than he had wanted to spend, but this was his only chance to get Gleam back. With a deep breath, he raised his paddle once more. 20 gold coins. A murmur rippled through the crowd as all eyes turned to him. The auctioneer grinned, clearly pleased with the sudden escalation. For a moment, the room fell silent. Even Eugene glanced over, clearly surprised at the boldness of the bid. Rusty could feel their gazes on him, but his disguise was sound, and as long as the money was there, he would be safe. The man in the blue cloak shifted slightly, his posture somewhat tense. One of his bodyguards leaned in, whispering something in his ear. It seemed that there was something to a Burden's words. They were clearly starting to count their coins, perhaps already over the limit. 20 gold coins, going once, going twice. The auctioneer's voice echoed again as he stretched out his words. He was there to sell the items for as much as he could. Doing this was done by giving them some time to decide, while also keeping it short to push them over the line, and in this case, it seemed to show some results. 21. The man called out while sounding a lot more annoyed than when he was bidding together with Eugene. Rusty took it as a sign that they also didn't have much money left and continued with confidence. He knew of bluffing during bartering at this point, and his voice was produced by a dead man's corpse. It would never be any nervousness in his voice as it was produced by his possession skill. 22 gold coins. The man in blue paused again, and the auctioneer tried to yank a bit more out of his two targets. 22 and 5 silver. 23. Their back and forth continued with longer pauses as his opponent tried scrunching for more money. Eventually, he declared his final price of 25, and finally, the battle had been won. Going once. Going twice. Sold. To the gentleman with paddle number 45. The auctioneer's final call rang through the hall, and with that, the mallet came down. Rusty's grip on the paddle loosened as he had almost crushed it. It was over. Gleam was his again. The crowd clapped politely, some casting curious glances in his direction, but he paid them no mind. All that mattered was that he had won. Congratulations, if you wish to take your prize, please follow our staff to finalize your purchase or remain here as there are still other items to bid for. The auctioneer said with a courteous nod while his people placed the cloth back over Gleam's cage and rolled her out of the auction. He knew the procedures, and there was nothing more that he was trying to bid for. All of his money would be gone after he paid for Gleam, and robbing others would probably not be possible for a while, but he didn't care. All he wanted was to get his friend back. Their adventurers were only starting as the world was their oyster. Now then, for our next item. Rusty instantly stood up and followed the auction staff through the hall's back entrance. He had spent nearly every coin he owned, but he was about to get Gleam back, and that was all that mattered. The grandiose atmosphere of the auction house faded as he passed through dimly lit corridors, descending into the building's storage area where the goods were collected after the sale. All the glitz and glamour vanished, replaced by a gritty, more practical environment. The storage area was lined with shelves filled with items, guarded by auction house staff standing watch over the various treasures. Rusty's focus, however, remained solely on Gleam, who had been carted out a few moments before he was allowed to leave the auction. "This is where you'll finalize the payment, sir." The attendant who he was following gestured him to a desk. Behind it, another old man sat with piles of papers and a large ledger. Behind him stood two armored men, both with hands on their weapons and ready to attack. "Please give me your number, sir." "Here." Rusty knew the procedures thanks to Alexander. He gave the man the paddle that he bid with, and this prompted the man to look through his paperwork. "Ah yes, lesser silvery magical gleaming ant, good choice, sir, that will be 25 gold coins." The auctioneer didn't pronounce Gleam's full evolution form, but this man clearly knew it. It was really happening. He had spent nearly a month down in the dungeon to free himself from the dungeon heart, and another 3 weeks to finally gather enough money to save his friend. If he had stopped at the 20 gold coins Alexander had proposed, this wouldn't have been possible. Nor would it have worked if he hadn't continued with the robberies or joined the Thieves' Guild. Do you have the money? If not, the man asked, and as he spoke, the 2 guards stepped forward. Rusty knew that anyone who couldn't present the gold immediately would be captured. It was forbidden to bid without having enough money. The payment had to be made on the same day as the auction, and no one was allowed to leave the premises until the debt was settled. These rules were in place because of previous robberies and people changing their minds after spending too much money. Rusty reached into the pouch strapped to his belt and slowly pulled out a heavy sack of coins. The metallic clink echoed through the room as he placed it on the desk. The attendant just nodded and took the sack into his hand. He undid the bit of twine that tied it together and poured out the contents on his desk. A cascade of coins spilled across the desk, gleaming under the dim light. Not all of them were gold as some were silver, but he knew that there was exactly the sum they required of him. 25 golden coins, it seems everything is in order. Congratulations on your purchase. The man didn't need to count as he had a skill that did it for him. With one glance he could tell that the total amount of the contents added up to exactly 25 golden coins. He then gestured toward one of the armored guards, who left the room to retrieve Gleam. Rusty felt a flood of relief. Soon, he would have her back. Moments later, Gleam's cage was wheeled into the room. Her pale, silvery white form shifted weakly in the confines, her antennae twitching as if sensing Rusty's presence. Despite the shackles, her glow seemed to brighten slightly at the sight of him. Their connection had been cut, but he knew that their bond would be reignited if he touched her. Now then, you're free to go once you sign the ledger. We will provide you with a scroll to end this monster's previous bonding contract, free of charge. With this key you will be also able to open the cage whenever you wish. The enchantments are temporary, but they can restrain the monster for a few more days. Rusty used Albert's memories to replicate his old handwriting and sign off in his name. He didn't need the scroll, but he could always sell it later. Now, with his old friend standing before him, strange emotions welled up from his metal chest, barely contained. Without the contract being triggered, he couldn't understand what his friend was saying. But at last, the moment had come for it to be renewed. The bonding contract with Gleam is being re-established, please wait. The moment Rusty heard the system message and saw the window appear before him, he could barely contain his excitement. It only took a moment, but soon his status was updated. The previously grayed out letters representing his bond with Gleam shone brightly once again. Congratulations, the bonding contract with Gleam has been re-established. Oh. It took a moment, but after touching one of Gleam's antennae, he finally rekindled their connection. His small, silvery friend was in distress, but she was okay. Her body was bound to the box, and she had been restrained, which only made things worse. However, it was all manageable now. His friend was there, and all he needed to do was get them both out of there. As Rusty gently caressed Gleam's antennae, she seemed to relax. He could feel her confusion, fear, and exhaustion, but underneath it all was a spark of relief. She knew she was safe now. Rusty picked up her cage with both his hands and started walking, the exit to the auction house being quite near. He was let outside by a few guards and the door was closed behind him as he found himself in an alleyway behind the auction house, but something fell off. We need to leave, now. Alexander's voice resounded in his helmet as he shouted. Something was indeed wrong, and it seemed that someone had been waiting for him. Rusty barely had time to register Alexander's warning before he heard footsteps echoing in the alleyway. Shadows shifted, and figures emerged at both ends, boxing him in. Rusty tightened his grip on Gleam's cage, his mind racing. The figure at the far end of the alley stepped forward, his blue cloak flowing behind him. It was the same man who had bid against him in the auction house. Flanked by 2 towering, heavily armored guards, the man moved his hood out of the way to reveal his face. Don't make this more difficult than it has to be, adventurer. Relinquish the monster to me and you can leave. The man's voice was smooth but laced with a warning. He looked to be a man over 60, his hair already grey. Rusty adjusted his stance, positioning Gleam's cage behind him. The man's eyes gleamed with an unsettling intensity, and he continued speaking, his tone deceptively calm. I'll even be generous, he said, producing a small pouch and shaking it so the sound of coins rang through the narrow space. 20 gold coins, right here. Not as much as you've paid, but I suppose your life should be worth more than 5 measly gold coins? It's a fair price, and I'm not here to spill unnecessary blood. But if you refuse..." Not only were there 2 armored men with him, but also an additional 2 soldiers blocking the side paths of the alleyway behind the auction house. The door leading back inside was thick, and he had heard it shut firmly behind him. Even if he tried to run back, getting through would likely be impossible. The auction house was a tall building, but he wasn't much of a climber. Rusty needed to decide, to fight or give in to their demands. "What? You want me to leave you here?" "I won't." Gleam called out to him from within the cage. She sounded quite distressed, her small, ant chirps quite faint. She seemed to want him to relinquish her to save himself. Rusty glanced down, slightly mad that she would even propose such a solution. There was no way he'd hand her over now, not after everything they'd been through. The blue-robed man took a step forward, his guards advancing in tandem, closing the space between them. His eyes narrowed as he gestured to the guards, impatience flickering across his face. "Very well, then. You leave me no choice but to take it from you by force." "Rusty, this doesn't look good, those people mean business. Maybe it would be better to think this through and..." "Shut up, I'm not giving Gleam up again." Alexander attempted to reason with Rusty, realizing these people weren't just simple adventurers. Their armor surpassed the E-rank level, and the most troubling figure among them was the one in robes. He carried himself like someone well-versed in battle and could very well be one of the worst opponents Rusty could face. But Alexander's thoughts and shouts couldn't reach him, as a burst of darkness erupted in all directions. "Oh!" The man in blue raised an eyebrow as Rusty's shadowy energy surged outward in a strange, mist-like form. Shadows spilled from Rusty's body like liquid smoke, flowing toward both sides of the alley where the armored men stood. It was a preemptive strike that none of them expected from someone who looked like a frontline fighter. The 4 guards faltered slightly, but their leader remained steady, raising a strange, crooked staff Rusty had never seen before. With a quick gesture, the man raised his magic weapon, and the gem atop it glowed, casting a shimmering blue shield, not around himself, but around Rusty. The magical barrier flickered as Rusty's shadows surged against it, and to his surprise, his previously unstoppable attack was fully contained. The dark mist swirled around in a circular pattern, unable to penetrate the blue wall of energy the man had conjured. Rusty's attack lacked raw power, functioning more as a debuff meant to weaken enemies upon contact. But unless it touched their bodies, it had no effect, and it seemed the man in the blue robe knew this all too well. "Interesting skill, but did you really think a little dark mist would make me cower? The darkness element is an interesting choice and I'm not sure how you are fine in there, but sooner or later you'll run out of mana to sustain it," he said mockingly while holding his staff towards Rusty's location. "You clearly lack the understanding of magic needed to wield those powers effectively, just give it up, you'll just damage the young lady's monster and that will be troublesome." Rusty found himself in a serious dilemma. He'd assumed that if he could just surround the area with his black mist, everything would be fine. Once his enemies started weakening, he'd planned to make a break for it. Even though he was cornered, this wasn't a dungeon, he was in a city teeming with various intelligent races. He had places to escape to, like the Thieves' Guild, and he'd even thought of diving into one of the wells or hoping that any late-night city guards might stall his pursuers. What should I do? Rusty wondered, seeking help from his guides as his initial plan started to crumble. He quickly retrieved some explosive potions from his stash tab and hurled them at the shimmering mana field. Covered by shadows, his attackers couldn't see him going through his inventory, just the explosions bursting against the shield. "Ha, what was that? A goblin fire potion? You must be joking." The mage holding the shield laughed, as though the idea of his barrier breaking from such a low-quality potion was absurd. "This isn't looking good. That mage is likely above D rank, nothing we have in our inventory will work on him, and those soldiers are probably all stronger than you, Rusty," Alexander observed grimly. The man in the blue robe seemed to be a powerful mage, at least a rank above Rusty. The only reason they hadn't been incinerated by magical flames was Gleam, as it was clear they wanted to capture her alive. Using powerful offensive spells would likely kill her instantly, and Rusty, who was defending her. "Then what am I supposed to do? Just give up and die?" Rusty snapped, his frustration increasing as he tossed all his remaining potions at the shield. Small explosions burst against the barrier, but none pierced through. Gleam, as a light-aligned creature, was somewhat protected from the dark mist, but the constant barrage of explosions was rattling her cage and causing enough damage that Rusty had to stop. Wait, that might not be a bad idea. A burden suddenly chimed in, surprising both Rusty and Alexander with an unexpected plan. You want me to die? Rusty asked, bewildered by the response. Well, in a sense. Don't you have a corpse inside yourself already? Yet. But I'm not sure where you're going with this. Just listen, I'll explain, and if this fails, we'll go with the backup plan. There's a backup plan. What do you take me for? I didn't become the Demon King by accident. Now, here's what we're going to do. Rusty was unsure where a burden was headed with this, and his mana was dwindling fast. He'd already splashed one mana potion over himself, but he couldn't keep the dark element attack up forever. As a burden laid out his risky, improvised plan, Rusty realized it wasn't half bad, and maybe, just maybe, it could work. I see, it might just work. As a burden finished explaining, Rusty nodded his head. He stopped the barrage of potions and let his hands drop, feigning surrender. A burden's plan was bold, bordering on reckless, but if executed properly, it might just turn the tide. First, he opened up Gleam's cage with the key he was given, letting her move onto one of his hands, and then he stopped the production of the pitch-black mist. Oh! Don't worry, Gleam, everything will be fine, just follow a burden's plan, we don't have another choice. Gleam didn't seem too happy about the order, but she wiggled her antennae as she understood the assignment. She had been stuck in a cage for more than a month now, and all her attempts at escaping had been thwarted. There was much at stake here, and this did seem like the only way out of it. After a few tense seconds, the darkness swirling inside the mana barrier began to die down. The mage watched Rusty carefully, noting his lowered stance and the way he seemed to sag under the weight of his armor. At last, Rusty fell to one knee and raised his hands in a display of surrender. About time. The mage sneered, lowering his staff. With a muttered incantation, the blue barrier flickered and dissolved. But why is the ant? He noticed one oddity: the white ant that had been in the cage was now out in the open, with the cage and key discarded to the side. While it would not be a problem for the man to recapture it again, he wondered what the armored man was trying to achieve. Soon he would realize, as with one swift and desperate motion, the ant was tossed high into the air. Bastard! What is the meaning of this? The mage's eyes narrowed with fury, but before he could conjure a new spell, Rusty unleashed another surge of dark mist to cloud everyone's vision, filling the alleyway with shadows once more. The blue-robed mage had no other choice but to bring up another barrier around him to stop the spread of the dark mist. Gleam flew high into the air and landed on the wall quite gracefully. The ant stuck to the bricks on the wall and looked down to the barrier around which Rusty remained. Soon after, she made her way back up and quickly crawled to the rooftop to disappear from sight. The mage attempted to cast a secondary spell, but he was too slow and perhaps afraid to hurt the creature he wished to capture alive. You will regret this. The mage glared furiously as the mana-filled bubble of darkness dissipated, revealing Rusty, sword and shield in hand, looking battle-ready. He ignored the mage's seething gaze and the guards' shouted profanities, instead activating one of his newest skills, Provoking Shout, and charging at the mage with all his strength. Get out of the way, you fools! The mage barked as his two armored guards immediately sidestepped. They cleared a path as their leader raised his staff, the jewel atop it glowing ominously. Flames began to flicker around it as the mage chanted a spell in a language Rusty couldn't understand. Determined, Rusty sprinted forward, aiming straight for the mage as if he had nothing left to lose. But before he even reached halfway, the mage's spell erupted, a blazing fireball shot forth, slamming into Rusty's shield and burning through it, sending him hurtling backward. Rusty's armored form crashed against the metal door of the auction house, leaving a slight dent. His shield, which had once withstood the blows of orcs and lizardmen, now bore a gaping, charred hole. The mage's spell had torn through his shield like it was nothing, and he found himself stunned, sprawled against the auction house's metal door. His helmet had been flung into the air, clanking down on the hard rocky ground to reveal a face that looked rather pale. Is he dead? One of the armored men called out as the body of their adversary just continued to slide down while slipping forward. There were no signals of life coming from him, they also couldn't see anything to indicate that they were breathing. The guards took cautious steps toward Rusty's unmoving form, their weapons at the ready. The mage, confident in his victory, lowered his staff and gestured to his men. Check if he's breathing, but be quick. I want that ant found before it scurries too far. One guard advanced, nudging Rusty's exposed neck with the tip of his sword. The pale face before him was blank, with a glassy stare but no blood trickling to indicate an injury. Yet it was clear that he was looking at a foe that wasn't there anymore. He's gone. Looks like the fireball finished him off, that darkness magic must have caused his body to look like this. The man could tell that there was something wrong with this core here. It was a lot paler than what a fresh body should look and assumed that magic was at play. Using cursed magic drains the body of its vitality. He must have burned through his mana and died to the plague of darkness. They gathered around the defeated foe, convinced of their victory. However, everything was unfolding just as Aberdan had predicted. The enemies assumed that Albert's body was his true form and that he had perished during the fight. The fact that they hadn't received any experience points from the battle would not raise suspicion, as they believed he had succumbed to his own darkness spell and was merely a dead man walking, someone who had effectively died by their own hands. Rusty's helmet lay against a nearby wall, waiting for their departure. This was his true and critical body part. The plan had been to feign death and hope they would leave him behind. With no chance to defeat them or escape, this was his only path to survival. However, Aberdan had miscalculated, as events began to stray from their intended course. Take his remains, we can't leave any proof behind. That ant couldn't have gone far. One of you, climb to the roof and search. You there, go get the tracker. Hurry up, we don't have time. We need to get that monster before the day comes. The mage barked orders, and to Rusty's dismay, they began lifting his body. While this was still manageable, since he only needed his helmet for survival, it became concerning when one of the guards seized it. Now, Rusty was being hauled off somewhere, while Gleam remained hidden in the city. While they were unaware of his true form, he still needed to play along. Things weren't looking well, but not all hope was lost, as his partner was free and he was not alone either.